Okay, so on November 10th, 2025, EASA issued a pretty critical airworthiness directive for the Airbus A350 fleet, and it's all about the APU air intake flap. In this explainer, we're going to break down all the key requirements of AD 25173 so you can get a real handle on how it impacts your operations. So the big question on everyone's mind is, how does this actually affect your A350s? Well, the actions you need to take really depend on your specific aircraft's configuration and its history. So let's dive into the details. All right, first things first. Let's look at the unsafe condition that made EASA issue this directive in the first place. What's the core risk we're talking about? The trigger for this AAD is pretty serious. Since 2024, there have been two separate reported cases where an A350's APU air intake flap completely detached while in service. I mean, that's a significant piece of the aircraft to lose. The investigation found a very clear root cause. It all starts with cracks forming in the flap's hinge areas, and those cracks are kicking off from corrosion pitting. But the real accelerator here was operating the aircraft under very specific MML conditions, basically with the APU intake flap open while the APU itself is off. This puts a ton of extra stress on that hinge and really speeds up how fast those cracks can grow. And EASA's language here is incredibly direct. They state that the potential outcome, if this isn't addressed, is the loss of the flap in flight, which, and I quote, could result in damage to the aircraft. That really highlights just how critical this is. Okay, now that we understand the risk, let's nail down the applicability and scope. Which specific aircraft and which components are actually targeted by this directive? So, the directive defines an affected part as any APU air intake assembly with these specific part numbers. You're going to want to check your inventory and your aircraft records because if you've got these parts installed, this AD applies directly to your hardware. Now, this part is super important. Your required actions depend entirely on which group your aircraft falls into. Group 1 is the highest risk. We're talking older aircraft delivered before 2019 that also have a history of those specific MMEL operations. Group 2 is a bit broader. It's an OR condition. Group 3 covers aircraft that have an affected part but don't meet the criteria for Groups 1 or 2. And finally, you've got Group 4. These are aircraft that don't have the affected hardware, but they are still on the hook for certain actions, as we'll see. So let's talk about what actually needs to get done. We'll break down the mandatory compliance actions for your technical, planning, and camo teams. The compliance journey really follows 4 main steps. First, an MMEL amendment is required across the entire fleet. Then, for the aircraft with those affected parts, there's a detailed initial inspection, and that's followed by repetitive inspections. Any findings, any damage, requires corrective action before the next flight. Simple as that. You've got to pay very close attention to these deadlines. For the highest risk Group 1 aircraft, you have just 4 months to get that initial inspection done. For Groups 2 and 3, the timeline's a bit longer, but it can get accelerated if you operate under the old MML conditions after the AD's effective date. So planning here is absolutely key. And this is not a one-and-done fix. After that initial check, this AD mandates a repetitive inspection of the affected parts every 24 months. This is a recurring task that has to be built into your long-term maintenance program. You know, beyond the hangar floor, this AD has some pretty significant implications for flight ops, for scheduling, and for management. So let's take a look at the bigger picture. This is the single most universal requirement. Within 90 days, every single A350 operator, and yes, that includes those in Group 4 that don't even have the affected part, has to implement the MMEL update. This update restricts that previous MMEL use that was found to accelerate the crack formation. All of your flight crews have to be informed. So from a management perspective, you really need to be thinking about 3 key areas. First is scheduled maintenance. You'll have to plan ground time for these inspections. Second is the risk of unscheduled repairs if damage is found, which can throw a wrench in things. And third is the impact on flight operations because of the new MMEL restrictions. So, how do we pull this all together and make sure we're in full compliance? Let's just recap with a clear plan of action. Here is your immediate to-do list. First, brief your flight crews on the MML changes. Second, get those initial inspections on the schedule based on your fleet's grouping. This is going to require tight coordination between planning, maintenance, and engineering. And finally, make sure your teams are thoroughly reviewing the source documents, the Airbus AOT, and the Honeywell Vendor Service Bulletin for all the detailed inspection procedures. And a final crucial reminder, this has been a summary to help you understand what's going on. But for execution, the official EASA AD document and its related service bulletins are the one and only authoritative sources. You have to ensure your compliance plan is based strictly on those official instructions.